Don't prove value, create it. Run experiments with the goal of creating value in the market right now. Product management is a business accountable generalist role. If you were the CEO of a company, would you fund your own team?
Welcome to Lean Stories. I'm Jonathan Bertfield, CEO of Lean Startup Co. This is where you can watch and listen to real stories from innovators and product leaders around the world, how they discovered lean principles, the breakthroughs that changed their approach, and the impact of putting customers at the center. Whether you're building your first product or driving change inside of a global company, these conversations will give you the tools and the inspiration to test, learn, and grow. Let's dive into today's Lean Story, where we'll meet Matt LeMay, a product management expert, an author, and a thought leader. We'll hear about Matt's belief that an entrepreneurial mindset is crucial for product managers, and his controversial but actually really straightforward take that experiments should create value, not just prove it. All right. I am super excited today to be chatting with Matt LeMay. Matt and I go back. We're going to talk a lot about Lean Startup, how Matt has used it, product management. We'll try and inject some plugs for both of Matt's books along the way. So looking forward to this conversation. Matt, welcome to this show.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, as always.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what are some of those, career moments that led you to the place where you're at today?
Sure. So my career, as you are well aware, has been strange and nonlinear. I started out as a music journalist a million years ago, then became a full-time touring musician. Learned to code, as I think a lot of musicians do, because somebody needed to build our website. And this was well before the days of Squarespace and Wix. So applied for jobs in advertising and in tech, as a lot of creatives do. Wound up at Bitly in New York as the first product manager there. Had 3 years of trial by hot fire. And from there, I really just couldn't stop running my mouth about product management and talking to people and learning and kind of trying to understand what this thing was. Because when I started working in product management, there were not a lot of resources available, and the resources that were available felt quite acutely different from the day-to-day work I was actually doing. So I like to tell people that I've been on this mission to kind of fall in love with reality and to embrace product management as the work that it is, to embrace the challenges, to embrace, the small wins and the incremental victories that really make up the majority of the wins and victories that we have working in this job in real world organizations. Spent the last 10 years or so consulting with MailChimp and Google and Spotify and lots of smaller and different companies with fancier or less fancy names, depending. I'm just really fascinated by the way that people work together to create things. I think that's why I still love making music and why I love consulting within organizations. Just every group of people making something together is a little bit different. And understanding and kind of tracing the contours of those differences and understanding how to work within those systems is super fascinating and super fun. So that's why I do what I do.
What it is about the role of being a product manager and building experiences for consumers and others. What do you think about that like taps into who you are and how you think about the world?
Yeah, so I've said a few times, and I think I still believe this, that product management is a business accountable generalist role, right? It's a generalist role in that you don't have the same deep expertise that, an engineer or a designer would necessarily have. And I think I was drawn in, as many people are, by the generalist piece, that as somebody who's always been broadly curious, who's been really interested in how things work, but never really developed any particular deep skill in any one dimension of how things work, I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. I think the business accountable piece is the one that I've struggled with more, and where ideas like Lean Startup have been really helpful to me. Because I think as product managers, we sometimes start to feel process accountable or politics accountable, or
Mm.
vibe accountable. And it's very easy to fall into some of those traps and stop recognizing that your job, to paraphrase Melissa Perry's book, Escaping the Build Trap, your job is to enable and accelerate a value exchange, right? It's like there's a business you're working for and there is some exchange of value at the heart of that business. And it is that exchange of value which is ultimately the heart of your work. I think it's taken me more time to really understand and embrace the business accountable piece and to see how embracing that piece can actually make your job easier, not harder.
In the startup world, we really think about the idea of value, right? And understanding what is the value to the particular audience that you're trying to serve and trying to validate that at different moments along the journey. So how do you think about that word and what's your challenge to the kind of common definition of viability?
Yeah, so there are a few common definitions of viability. Sometimes it's, defined as can we build this profitably? Sometimes it's defined as can we build this in a way that makes sense for the business? I tend to prefer the latter definition, in part because different businesses have different needs and different scales of needs, right? This is, I think, the big challenge with viability is can you make a product that delivers some tiny incremental bit of value to a user who's not your primary user and 10 people use it? Yeah, probably. Is 10 people using your product going to justify the investment the business has made in your product team? Probably not. I don't think you can really account for viability, and I'm using the word account in an innovation accounting context here. I don't think you can account for viability unless you know what specifically the business needs to see from any particular product or initiative or experiment that's being run. So I think that the challenge with viability, as with a lot of things in product world, is not just to look at the vanity metrics and say, hey, we built this thing and 10 people used it, but to say, well, how many people need to use it for this to be viable for the business? What does the business want out of this? Do they just want to say, like, yes, we can get some people using this? Do they want growth? Do they want revenue? Do they want profitable revenue? Do they want to explore new business models and say, like, look, we don't want revenue for this? But if you don't understand what specifically viability means in the context of your business and your business model, then I don't think you can build things that are viable.
Do you find in your journey and all the different companies that you've worked with and speak to, they're actually operating with an innovation accounting mindset? So they're thinking about leading metrics versus lagging metrics. They're thinking about kind of what's the connection point between where we are today versus where we need to get to. Do you see that in practice?
I see a lot of organizations struggling with it. I think part of why I really like the concept of innovation accounting is that it's taking finance, which is often something that product teams don't think about, and it's kind of making it an explicit part of the conversation, right? Like, how do we actually measure success? Are we looking short term? Are we looking long term? Are we looking to drive an existing business model? Are we looking to explore new business models? Um, and I think that's a question a lot of folks are asking. And honestly, the biggest challenge I see is that a lot of organizations just don't really have an open conversation about how they're accounting for success at all, right? There's just the sort of the sense of like build it and, if we do something and can point to it and make it defensible, I think, vanity metrics are and defensibility metrics are very closely related. It's like people see their job as to defend the work they're doing rather than to align their work towards what the business really needs. So I think that having that conversation about, the way I see it coming up the most right now is in the conversation about short-term versus long-term accounting, right? Are we trying to hit the quarterly number or are we trying to work towards this 5-year product vision? And
Yeah.
what's interesting is I think you can't work towards the 5-year vision if you are only working towards the quarterly revenue goals. But in some cases, the business just needs to work towards the quarterly revenue goals. Like sometimes that's the reality of the business, right? That yes, we talk a lot about the vision and the mission and our 5-year plan, but at the end of the day, the market is just looking at your quarterly performance. And it's been really interesting to bring some of those conversations to the fore, to have them with product teams and to ask this question openly at organizations like, yes, we want this and that. We want the innovation and we want the business as usual. We want the quarterly earnings and the 5-year innovation. But how are we actually willing to resource against these? Are we willing to have some teams and say, like, look, the way we measure your success is going to be different? Because if we're not willing to do that, it's probably never going to happen.
what you were just describing and what we think about in innovation accounting, it's like these are the steps we're going to take and this is what we're going to see along the way, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know, there's a fear or there's a lack of capability to actually articulate that journey. I mean, how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is absolutely a fear in a lot of cases. I think folks, you know, the conversation I have that disappoints and frustrates the most product managers, and I have lots of disappointing and frustrating conversations with product managers, is when they come to me and say, "Hey, we shipped this thing and it got this many users and this much revenue." And I'm like, "All right, well, how much did you expect?" Right? Like, is that good or bad? Because you can throw a number at me and sound excited, but
Yeah.
was this what we expected to happen? And if it's not what we expected to happen, then what was our assumption that was incorrect? Right? When you and I work together, I always love doing assumption mapping exercises because it's such an interesting way of looking at, like, every strategy has assumptions baked into it. Every project
Sure.
plan has assumptions baked into it. And if you bring those out, if you bring those forward, if you don't try to hide them and bury them, but you talk about, like, okay, here's what we expect to see. Here are the assumptions that go into this. Here's how we're going to adjust course. Here's how we're going to talk about this together. If you get out ahead of those conversations, then in effect, making it impossible to then 6 months from now say, well, that's exactly what I thought would happen, regardless of what happens. And again, in organizations where people are accountable to the politics, to the appearances, to the defensibility of their work, not to the actual impact for the business, then that's a really scary thing to give up.
Yeah. So who's doing that well? Who's thinking about strategy and thinking about those metrics in the right way?
It's really interesting. My friend Martin Erickson just wrote a piece on LinkedIn today, which I reposted, where he basically says, like, and I agree with this so hard that, and I'm paraphrasing him a little bit, but a lot of the best strategic thinking is actually happening at the team level. That the teams that are doing really well aren't the ones waiting around to be handed a perfect strategy, or the ones who are saying, we got a strategy, but I don't agree with it, or it's bad, or it's incoherent. Like, a lot of corporate level strategies that are developed by executive committee are not great. I will leave it at that. But
Hmm.
what I'm seeing, which is really interesting, is that the teams that are really thriving, the teams that are delivering business impact, the teams that are, effectively de-risking their work, are the teams that are saying, like, either here's what we think the strategy is in a way that makes sense and that is specific and actionable, or, like, here are three different options we have. Which of these is on strategy? So sometimes when the strategy is not actionable, the most effective teams are like, all right, you know, there's this strategy document that executives came up with and released with a lot of fanfare. And maybe they sat in a room together and pretended to like each other, and everybody got their one little pet project in the strategy. And then they didn't want to talk to each other anymore. So they said, the strategy's done. Bye. But the teams that are really effective are the ones who say, okay, cool, thank you for this strategy. Here are the three different paths we could take. Which one does this strategy actually lead us down? Who can kind of force that subtractive this, not that thinking? Who can use that connection between strategy and prioritization as a way to clarify both strategy and prioritization? Who can really activate that circuit and clarify through specific decision making? Again, I see that happening a lot more at the individual team level, which I think is really interesting.
That willingness to push and to be scrappy, that feels very much like a lean startup mindset to me. Like, do you see that as the norm, or is that like those people are like right on the edge and they're breaking boundaries? Like, how do you see that?
It's funny, in product management, we've had this debate for over a decade now about whether or not the product manager is the CEO of the product or the mini CEO. And, I used to be like, no, bleh, I hate that. And now I'm like, well, I think a good product manager gets the entire team thinking like the CEO, right? A good product manager doesn't just take that on themselves, but actually aligns the way that their entire team thinks with the way the broader business thinks. So, the first question I ask in my new book is, if you were the CEO of the company, would you fund your own team? And I love that question because it is an entrepreneurial question, right? It's like, if you were accountable for the existential success of the business, would you consider your team a good investment? And I think a lot of product people don't know how to answer that question, Or they think, well, that's not really my problem. But if we've seen anything in the market in the last couple of years, it's that it is your problem. Because eventually the CEO, the CFO, folks who are responsible for the market level existential success of the business are going to look at your team and say, do we need these people? Are they a good investment? Are they doing something that really matters to the business? What I'm trying to get across to people is like, whether or not you think you are in that position, you are in that position, right? Whether or not you think you're accountable, whether or not you think you're responsible for aligning with the business, whether or not you think you should be thinking like the CEO certainly is thinking like the CEO. And, the CFO certainly is looking at like, is this team a good investment? So to me, it's really less a matter of like, how many and are people thinking about this, but rather are people acknowledging that this is the reality of their situation, right? Are people willing to look at this and say like, look, when I was a product manager, I just sort of assumed that my team's existence was like a righteous permanent fact of the universe, right? Like my team exists, we pick the next defensible thing to work on, and it'll be like this forever and ever and ever, and then I'll get promoted and then it'll all be great. But that's not the reality of this work. And I think, again, once people learn to look with clear eyes at that reality and work with it, not against it, then their jobs actually get easier.
If I'm managing a group of product managers, or I'm a CEO, right, of a product organization or a company that builds products, how do I instill that mindset? How do I drive that culture, whatever label we want to put on it, whether
Yeah.
that's a lean startup mindset or anything else? How do the best leaders drive that home?
They keep things straightforward. They don't overcomplicate. They don't add crap to the middle. This is one of my huge pet peeves is I'll work with organizations and they're like, we want to be more impact driven. And I'm like, how many OKRs do you have? And they're like 500. It's like, okay, you are not going to be an impact driven organization. Like if you have so many fiddly little low level cascaded goals, then the management, like just the cognitive overhead to manage those goals becomes a full-time job. Which is again why I think that kind of entrepreneurial mindset is so important, because the most effective product teams I work with aren't sitting there saying, how do we align our 49 OKRs with the 49 OKRs of the organization? They're like, how do we do stuff that actually delivers value? And I think that product leaders can get caught up in the theater of it all, can get caught up in the cascading and in the doing work that feels very important and fancy, and sort of the multi-step cascading alignment, rather than just asking teams directly, what is the impact of the work you're doing and how do we support you? So I think part of the challenge for product leaders is to keep the conversation at that altitude and to not let those lower altitude conversations become a stand-in for the conversation about what impact should these teams be driving, how are they doing it, what are they measuring, and how are we giving them the resources and support they need to achieve their goals.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. One of the core tenets of lean startup is experimentation. We're trying to learn before we push out into the market, and we're trying to learn once we pushed out into the market, right? So it's a continuous cycle of learning. Let's start with the positive. Like, what are the ways that you've seen product teams really embrace that both mindset and practice? How are they learning? How are they running experiments? What's built into their business as usual operational activity?
Yeah, so I have a strong opinion on this one, shockingly. It comes largely from my friend Tim Casasola, who's a great writer about product, really, really smart thinker and writer. He said something in one of his newsletters that just stuck with me so hard, which was, don't prove value, create it. I'm going to say that one more time because I think that's really key to this. Don't prove value, create it. In other words, don't run experiments with the goal of proving in the abstract whether or not something could theoretically at some point in the future, if resourced properly, create value. Run experiments with the goal of creating value in the market right now. And that to me has been the key differentiator. When I worked with MailChimp, there was a team that shipped a product that people have been asking for, and they just kind of built it on existing infrastructure. They were like, let's just get this out, right? Like we have all the infrastructure we need. We have feature flags so we can run it with a small group. Let's get it in front of people and see if they use it, right? Like we have all these assumptions that, this is something people want, but rather than putting it on a roadmap and building it, saying, "Oh, we're going to build this and architect it perfectly in a year." Let's get it out, see if it creates value for people, see where it doesn't create value for people, see, the plans we make a year from now are probably not going to be what the market actually steers us towards. And it was really interesting to see how they shipped this. It created value, and suddenly, like folks were rethinking their roadmaps. Having real value in the market, having users actually interacting with something, having folks saying, "We want this, we don't want this, this works, this doesn't work," kind of blew all the theoretical conversation out of the water. And I think that's really key to how organizations successfully implement experimentation. Is like if you treat this as an academic exercise and then you go around shopping your validated learnings and saying which team wants to now actually turn this into a product, nobody likes having things proven at them. You're not going to have a great time doing that. But if you say like, "Hey, we shipped this thing. These people are using it. If this many more people use it, it drives this much more impact. This is how it affects the work we're doing." Like it is out there. There is value being created in the market with real customers right now. That's how things actually move.
Mm. I love that. One of the biggest challenges to doing that, right, either the way that you just described or just in general experimentation, that I see a lot is, hey, we don't have time. We don't have time to learn. We just got to build, right? We just got to get it out there. Like whoever is the stakeholder, the leader, the competitor who is pressuring, we don't have time to learn our way to success. Um, how do you see the best teams, or when you're advising product teams, how do you get them to resist that temptation to avoid getting into the learning and just execute?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I mean, I think again, when you treat learning as a discrete, separated activity, it's probably not going to be something that's prioritized. I mean, that's part of why I've always liked the build, measure, learn loop as a sort of single entity, right? It's like this is the loop at the heart of what we're doing. It's not like, oh, now like learning is over there. It's like this is all part of one thing that we do, and this is how we build. And I think, again, folks are afraid to learn because when you learn, you give up some control. When you learn, you have to say, like, did this actually work? You have to actually say, like, I remember I was working with a product manager at MailChimp who did her first, like, direct user test with an unfinished product. And she came back and she was like, that was horrible. I get why people don't want to do that. Like, so many of the things I was so proud of, like, they didn't care about. And things that I thought were really obvious, they didn't understand. And things that, like, and I had to just kind of sit there and, like, not tell them why it's so great and not tell them why I love it so much and why it's the right thing. I just had to sit in kind of the ambiguity of the thing I had created, and I just think people don't like doing that. Like, I think, again, part of the reason I have been ringing this bell for business impact is, like, I really do believe that focusing on business impact forces you to be customer centric, right? Because business impact is market level. You can't just ship something and say, "We generated, profitable growth from it." You have to learn. You have to bring that learning into the mix because the risk of shipping something that fails is essentially the same as the risk of shipping nothing at all at that point, right? Like, if you're not just celebrating like, "Oh, look, we built something." If it's like, "I don't care what's the impact it had," then what you're doing is you're essentially leveling the risk of not building with the risk of building the wrong thing. And I think that unless you do that in a way that folks understand, that makes people feel brave and pressured in a good way enough to go off and actually learn those things, it's just very hard to make that happen.
Yeah. I would assume the next part of the conversation with your friend at MailChimp was, it was horrible, it was awful, I was super uncomfortable, but I learned a ton from that experience, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But I think it's important to hold both of those things, right? That like this is
Yeah.
important work, but I think people are not necessarily prepared for how, I said this in my last book in product management and practice that I think part of the reason folks fail at learning is that the way you approach stakeholders and the way you approach users is almost completely different, right? When you're approaching stakeholders, you want to get to clarity. You want to kind of get people 100% affirmed. You want to have them understand how everything's going to work and get them bought in and give them specific options and have them choose. With users, you can't do that. Like, you can't go in and say like, well, I want people to like be 100% committed to exactly this path. And if this doesn't happen, like you're going in with no cards, right? You're going in like, just tell me how you use this. Like, show me what's working for you, what's not working for you. It's so hard to do that. And it's such a different mindset and skill set to cultivate. I think there's this tension, right? Where on the one hand, I 100% believe like bad user research is better than no user research. Get people out there, have people do it quickly. But I think we also underestimate the emotional challenge of doing user research. That like what I see trip people up isn't that they're not skilled up in whatever the methodologies are. It's that they're not prepared for how uncomfortable it's going to be.
Do you think that's true? Do you think that like the product organization, people who are building products across both small and large companies, everyone just knows how to do it now, so we don't need any more guidance?
I think guidance and frameworks are very different things.
Mm,
I remember, I think the moment that my kind of like seeing the matrix moment was after you and I did some work together actually for a company in the US that had gone through a scaled agile transformation that had left a lot of open questions. Like, what is a product? Why are our business analysts all product owners? What are we supposed to do now? And, we did our best to help folks understand, ask the right questions, kind of apply contextual critical thinking to their own roles. About 6 months after that, I got the Harvard Business Review in the mail, and the cover was a case study of how that organization, before we got there, had achieved 100% agile adoption at scale. I think people mistake the framework itself for the intended outcomes of the framework, right? You can implement agile at scale and still have your business fail and still have people be unclear. I think the challenge for folks always is saying like, well, what do you actually want to achieve here? Like, not picking the newest framework and saying, oh, I need to be up to date on frameworks. I'm seeing this all the time with AI now. We're like, we need to adopt AI. It's like, why? What is the actual goal we're working towards here? How will we measure success? How will we know if this worked? And I think in a lot of cases, the answer is like FOMO, just like, well, we need to do this because everyone else is doing this, which is not a great answer. So I think that guidance, that on the ground support, working with people who can help facilitate and coach and train and support you through those things, who can say like, yeah, it is challenging to do user research if you haven't done it. It is challenging to think in smaller prototypes and ship and build and measure and learn. Like, these are not complicated frameworks where we say follow these 27 steps or else. These are new ways of approaching things that are best implemented with the support and guidance of folks who have been through this before. And I think that that's a really important distinction that gets lost a lot in a world where there are, frankly, a lot of folks like, and a lot of, major consultancies pushing these frameworks as silver bullet, one size fits all solutions, rather than saying like, hey, this is challenging. This is important. Let's figure out what your needs are and how we can work together to help make sure you actually get out of this what you want to get out of it.
right. Love that. Love that. Great note to finish on. I don't remember anything about that engagement that you were talking about other than the great culinary tour that you took us on before, during, and after those sessions. So thank you for those memories. This was a great conversation, Matt. Really appreciate your thought leadership in your books and in everything you do and what we've talked about today. So thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That's today's Lean Story. Stay tuned for the next one coming to YouTube very soon. And if you're ready to take lean practices further, our team at Lean Startup Co. can help through audits, training, coaching, consulting. Visit leanstartup.co to learn more. Be sure to subscribe for more stories from the people changing how we build products and businesses. Until next time, keep iterating, keep learning, and keep your customers first.